Good evening. I'm speaking to you tonight to give you a report on the state of our nation's economy, and regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression. Well, we cut your tax rates anyway by nearly 25%. And what that helped trigger was falling inflation, falling interest rates, and the strongest economic expansion in 30 years.
Entering the 1980 presidential campaign race, former actor and governor Ronald Wilson Reagan was heavily favored. His strong anti-communist ideas dating back to the days of the Hollywood 10 and his proposed economic policies appealed to a wide variety of Americans. Ronald Reagan's landslide win in 1980 over then-President Jimmy Carter solidified a shift in American politics from liberalism to conservatism in the executive branch. The presidential actions of Democrats Lyndon B. Johnson and Jimmy Carter, and arguably even the scandals surrounding Republican Richard Nixon, led the American public to favor a more conservative approach and reduction in government involvement in the economy. Much of Reagan's presidency was defined by his trickle-down economic policies, which were often referred to as Reaganomics, that suggested cutting taxes in the top marginal tax brackets would trickle down and stimulate those in the lower class. Though some Americans, particularly conservative and upper-class Americans, would favor these policies, Reaganomics became a topic of controversy for lower-class and liberal Americans that felt Reagan's economic policies failed to stimulate the growth promised. Reagan's economic policies came to the forefront of national debates with the passing of the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, which cut federal income taxes significantly. And while income taxes were cut for the rich, middle class, and poor alike, the percentage of tax cuts varied, with the top marginal tax bracket receiving a 20% decrease in taxes, while the lowest tax brackets received cuts of around 3%. At the time, the United States' economy was entering a recession as a result of the oil energy crisis in the late 1970s. This recession led Reagan to implement the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982 that implemented large tax increases, contrary to what Reagan had campaigned for with the trickle-down economic policies. However, these tax increases somewhat increased government revenue, which helped stimulate the economy. Additionally, Reagan concentrated on using his economic policies to halt the high inflation rates that were causing the economic recession. In order to decrease inflation, Ronald Reagan tightened control of the money supply, which effectively strengthened the value of the dollar and lowered the percent change in inflation from 13.5% in 1980 to 6.1% in 1982. Americans quickly became divided over Reagan's economic policies. On one side, many Americans argued that despite policies such as the Job Training Partnership Act of 1982, which was enacted as a job creation program during the recession, Reagan was still neglecting to help the poor. This point of view is clearly expressed in Louisiana Red and Carrie Bell's song, "Reagan is for the Rich Man."
You know Reagan is for the rich man. Poor man ain't got no way. Rich people getting richer and poor people dying by the day.
Throughout his presidency, Reagan decreased funding for Medicaid, food stamps, several education programs, and environmental services such as the Environmental Protection Agency. These program cuts, in addition to the 1981 tax cuts that substantially helped the upper class, led to the highest monthly unemployment rate in 1982 and would continue to widen the rich and poor gap. Reagan continued to spark resistance when he implied that the homeless chose to be in their position during his final year in office.
I know that Ronald Reagan grew up very poor, so I'm thinking part of him would want to support poor people. However, I do know that he spent the later part of his life very wealthy and among wealthy people. So I think some of it probably is ignorance of how people lived.
Despite the opinion that Reaganomics neglected the lower class, many Americans saw the Reaganomic policies as the primary reason the United States eventually began experiencing growth in 1983, effectively moving out of the recession.
First, you had Reaganomics, which took us out of a stale economy, and it really took off.
The stimulated economy boosted Reagan's popularity and allowed for him to successfully campaign for re-election in 1984. Oftentimes, his campaign ads referenced his economic policies as proving that his leadership was working.
The difference is Reaganomics works for you. Mondalenomics works against you.
Considering the tax and program cuts, the Reagan administration generally considered Reaganomic policies successful. However, one aspect of Reaganomics that Reagan failed to complete was a decrease in budget deficits. Although he attempted to cut the budget by decreasing federal funding for various programs, Reagan was unable to ever substantially decrease the deficit. With about the same amount of money coming into the government from tax revenue, Reagan hoped the government debt would be alleviated. However, there was one particular area of federal funding that Reagan did not cut: military spending. Throughout his presidency, Reagan spent a significant amount of the federal budget on supporting the military and protecting the United States through his policy of peace through strength. One of the programs was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which focused on protecting the United States from nuclear attacks by developing missile shields. Military spending nearly doubled between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan's presidencies. Ronald Reagan's economic policies of Reaganomics helped bring the economy out of the recession of the early 1980s, reduced the government's involvement, and lowered income taxes. However, Reagan failed to substantially decrease the deficit. While Reagan's supporters praised these policies, many lower-class and liberal Americans were concerned with Reagan making the rich richer and the poor poorer, as well as the cuts in federal programs. No matter what perspective is taken, Reagan's legacy as a president has lived on in his economic policies. In today's world, nearly every policy related to tax cuts is compared to the actions taken during this period of Reaganomics.